Video games can never be art. That was the title of a now infamous article from 2010 by perhaps the most famous film critic in the world, Roger Ebert. And to some degree, to people who have never experienced the full spectrum that video games have to offer, or they remember that silly little game they used to play when they were a kid, this is a pretty understandable assumption to make. When games began, they consisted of simplistic and maybe even mindless actions performed by a player in a game that was usually a translation of a pre-existing pastime from real life. Video games were once a black screen with some white lines on it that made a square of pixels move from one side of the screen to the other. It's hard to remember that those simplistic games were only about 50 years ago. Video games have evolved at lightning speed, from being simple games that ate your money in the arcades to being fully realised experiences involving a myriad of moving parts. From story, graphics, AI, characters, gameplay, level design, sound design, and user experience to create entire living things. What was once a way of keeping a kid occupied during summer has evolved into a $200 billion industry and affected culture and society through transformative experiences that can't be tackled in other mediums. So the question is, why is there still so much pushback on the notion that video games can be art? Well, let's circle back to that Roger Ebert article from 2010. Ebert had actually mentioned this subject before in 2005. Following a discussion about the film adaptation of the game Doom, Ebert wrote, "To my knowledge, no one in or out of the field has ever been able to cite a game worthy of comparison with the great dramatists, poets, filmmakers, novelists, and composers. That a game can aspire to artistic importance as a visual experience, I accept. But for most gamers, video games represent a loss of those precious hours we have available to make ourselves more cultured, civilized, and empathetic." A rather scathing and unflinching assessment of games and their place in society. The remarks were met with outcry from lovers of games everywhere. The following year, Ebert participated in a panel discussion on the topic that explored his opinions further. Amongst many of his criticisms on the idea, he stated that video games do not explore the meaning of being human as other art forms do. He added to this when referring to a game's interactivity and choice by proposing the idea of a version of Romeo and Juliet where the player could decide if they would like a happy ending or a sad ending, which he argued would weaken the artistic expression of the work. So, with his opinion being made abundantly clear, why return to the subject? Well, in 2009, Kelly Santiago of That Game Company, the studio behind games such as Journey, Flow, and Flower, gave a TED Talk in which she explored the idea of games as an art form by acknowledging and even accepting some of Ebert's criticisms on the subject. When looking at Ebert's initial quote, Santiago agreed that games had never produced a piece of work comparable to the great artists and creators of other mediums. But when looking back on the early creations of those art forms, they didn't either. Santiago's point being that games are a new art form, and at the time of her talk, had only started to become an artistic medium where ideas and emotions were expressed further. To add to this point, she presented the audience with a picture of a cave drawing showing the evolution of chicken scratches on a wall to a masterpiece like the Sistine Chapel. So after hearing Santiago's point, you might think that that seems like a fair compromise. Maybe games aren't art yet, but they could be someday, or maybe they're just beginning to be. Unfortunately, Ebert didn't agree. He published an analysis and slide-by-slide criticism of Santiago's presentation, taking apart every sentence and observation she made. He remarked on her reference to commercial success as a measurement of a game's overall success, and quite frankly belittled her argument and ideas in an incredibly rude and dismissive manner. Just look at his closing paragraph. I allow Santiago the last word. Toward the end of her presentation, she shows a visual with 6 circles, which represent, I gather, the components now forming for her brave new world of video games as art. The circles are labelled development, finance, publishing, marketing, education, and executive management. I rest my case. After hearing Roger Ebert's refusal to acknowledge games as an art form, it's easy to characterize him as a grumpy old man unwilling to move with the times and changing technologies. In his own admission, Ebert didn't even play games, so how can he remark on such a topic? But is there something beneath what he is saying? If games aren't art, what are they? To call them a pastime or hobby may be appropriate when playing something like Candy Crush or FIFA, but to call every game that feels dismissive and simply untrue. Games can be evocative and emotional. They challenge our ideals, make us question our morality, and tell stories in ways that are not possible in traditional media formats. In her presentation, Santiago brought up a number of definitions to try and understand where games fit into our understanding of art. One being, art is the process of deliberately arranging elements in a way that appeals to the senses or emotions. Well, isn't that exactly what games are capable of? Even games that are built around a simple mechanic such as Tetris or Minesweeper, isn't there a beauty in the design of these games and the choices they force the player into making? Of course, they do not express emotions themselves, but they can still create those feelings in the player. I think it's fair to accept that not all games are art. So in one way, Roger Ebert was correct. But in so many other ways, he and people like him are so wrong. Games are beautiful. And I don't mean their graphics or artwork, I mean the way they can make a player feel. The impact they can leave on someone, the lessons they can teach, and the emotional power they have over us. Yes, they can be a source of fun, competition and mindless action, but so can any art form, really. How many movies have you seen that have been displays of big budget explosions or surface level romance stories that you can barely recall 5 minutes after watching? But at the same time, how many great films have you seen that convey the deepest human emotions? How many films have inspired you to be something or do something? How many films have shown you something you couldn't have possibly seen any other way? Well, games are capable of doing all of these things. Roger Ebert once criticised interactivity in video games by saying it damaged the work's creative expression. But interactivity and player choice are actually video games' greatest strengths. Being able to react to a player and create a world that reacts to their decisions and interactions is something that no other medium can provide, and opens the door for a multitude of unique stories and experiences to players. Whilst there are arguments against the idea, games can be art, and fit almost every definition and constraint we have for being so. People have argued against it since the idea was first introduced, and people will continue to do so long after. But I want to leave you with a quote by Phil Fish, the creator of Fez, that I think sums up what games are to those who make them and to those of us who play them. To me, video games are the ultimate art form. It's just the ultimate media. I mean, it's the sum total of every expressive medium of all time, made interactive. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more videos, and leave a comment down below if you'd like to join in on the conversation.